Hi, this is the Reverend Andrew Christiansen. You're listening to Doth Protest Too Much. We are a Christ-centered, reformationally minded podcast that explores the history and theology of the Christian Church. This podcast originally started as a forum for discussing the developmental history of Christian thought, what is often called historical theology. And it has since grown into an ecumenical team of hosts, myself, Stephen Burnett, Pastor Charlie Lehmann, and the Reverend James Rickenbaker. We're all interested in the past, present, and future of the church. We share a commitment to the central place that grace has in the message of the good news, a message we feel often gets lost in our day and age, sometimes in religion itself. A message that is of God's goodwill toward us, as echoed in the following words from St. Paul. This is a true saying, and worthy of all men to be received, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the chief one. I pray that the discussions in our episodes, whether casual or scholarly, can speak to how the story and witness of Christians from our past can comfort and strengthen us for today. God bless.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Doth Protest Too Much. This is the first episode of the year 2023, so I hope everyone had a blessed Christmas or continuing to have a blessed Christmas season, seeing as we're still in it, and a good year so far. A little early to tell, but of course we hope you are having a good one. And we're here with Zac Neubauer, president of EFAC. Zac's been on the show a couple times. So I'm delighted to have
one of their first guests, I think, right?
Yeah, you were one of like our episode 4 or 5 or something, and then we had you on like early fall, I think.
Yeah, sounds right.
And what did we do? Oh, you talked about like the evangelical tradition of within Anglicanism.
Yeah, a lot about Charles Simeon. We ended up talking about him.
Simeon was the main topic, and a little bit about John Stott, and it was a fun episode. I think that was that's one of our more popular ones too, by the way. So we get some hits. So but yeah, we appreciate everyone's listenership. I don't do this enough, but for our listeners, just a reminder to go ahead and give us a review or rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, however you listen to us, just because we appreciate the feedback and how algorithms work. The more ratings we get, the more it gets out there somehow. I don't understand that stuff. I didn't.
Who knows how it works, but it works.
I didn't go to school for that stuff. So today we have a fun episode. We are talking about favorite books we've read over the past year. Some of these books may be from this past year. We try to be relevant, but some of them may be far before 2022. None of my books, spoiler, are relevant. They're not from 2022. But I'm joking because I would argue they are relevant. But so yeah, I'm sitting in my office here at St. Michael's. This is my first day on the job, other than yesterday, my first Sunday. It was a beautiful service. From what I heard, I guess we had a lot of parishioners we haven't seen in a while, kind of coming back because of the new rector, and so that's exciting.
Great.
And I'm just excited about this, and it's good. So how you doing, Zac?
Doing well. So blessings on this new venture of yours. Congratulations on this call. So
thank you.
I am in windy and chilly Northern California this morning. So all that rain came through over the weekend and had some flood warnings and whatnot. And it's drying up a little bit, but getting ready to start all over again. So sitting at my office at St. Clement's in Rancho Cordova, California. So,
well, yeah, and so you're kind of remind me of your role. You're associate there, right? And
I'm actually the interim priest in charge. So I am the only clergy here on staff, but I'm serving interim, and it's also a part-time interim. So it's a unique arrangement, but one that I came up with. So it's not for any lack of willingness on my part. But it's good that it's an interim position, and if you want to move to the Diocese of Northern California and take a position, this would be a good one to take come probably May or so. They're going to be looking again. So it's just not something that's going to work out for me long term, but
well, I know we have clergy
deserves
listeners.
to work out for somebody. So
yeah, I imagine we have some clergy listeners. I wouldn't be surprised that's half the audience. So y'all heard that there is a possible new vocation in the mix. So for you, get a hold of Zac Neubauer or email the podcast. We'll put you to him, put you through to him. So let's go through these books.
So what books are you reading?
Well, I was going to have you go first, or unless it's up to you. I could go first. We're going to be sharing.
Sorry, it froze up on my end, so I'm not sure what happened there. So I apologize.
Oh, what just happened? I was just saying, giving the listeners what we're about to be getting into, what this episode's about. We each picked 3 books we liked. I already said that, didn't I?
You might have.
Just to reiterate, we're going over 3 books. Zach's going over 3 he liked. I'm going over 3 he liked. From that we've read over the past year, whether they're published from the past year or not. And then we're going to share one we disliked. And so let's dive right in. Zach, do you want to share one you liked?
Yeah, so one I liked, it's called He Descended to the Dead. It's subtitled An Evangelical Theology of Holy Saturday by Matthew Emerson. He is at Oklahoma Baptist University. It's printed by IVP Academic. And this actually, I think, won Christianity Today's Book of the Year. It was pretty high up there in 2020. So it came highly recommended. And his kind of contention is that when he says evangelicals, he's thinking kind of non-denominational evangelicals, more kind of folks in the Baptist non-liturgical traditions, but that we don't know what to do with Holy Saturday. We can get along with Good Friday and Easter. It definitely makes sense, but what is Holy Saturday? What does it mean that Christ descended to the dead? And he takes on, looks at what this means in terms of Scripture. He has the biblical, historical, theological foundations for it, and looks at what it means. Examines the verses for First Peter, for example. Jesus ministering to the spirits. What does that mean? Those different things, and then takes a look at how this has been understood throughout church history. And part of what I thought was really interesting was he contends that it's Calvin who kind of tweaks this understanding of what Christ did between his death and his resurrection in a way that's now very familiar for a lot of people. So Calvin's contention was that part of that Christ was suffering in his death, essentially, that he descended into hell, and so he's a day's worth of hell is finished, is the end of his suffering, whereas throughout most of church history there was an understanding that Holy Saturday was a triumphal time, or at least a restful time. Christ is having his Sabbath in that time. And so I just thought it was something I hadn't really thought about very much as to how I viewed it, especially having come from non-denominational evangelical traditions, and realized how much of my assumptions were wrong, really. So it's a lot. It gives something. It makes a great basis. Next time you're preaching at an Easter vigil or even a Good Friday service, maybe take a look at it and see how he how he unpacks that and maybe help you see it in a fresh new way.
Yeah. When it comes to Holy Saturday, that all is in its own way kind of a neglected day, because when I think about it, even in the mainstream Episcopal world, there's we don't really know what to do, and I include myself in there. I mean, I was literally just talking about Holy Week. I know it's like not. There's plenty of things.
Start thinking about it now. Yeah.
I was talking about it with someone earlier who was at the church earlier, and we were talking about what's usually been the norm here, and then Saturday, uh, there's been different things on Saturday, and it's one of those days. It's not firmly like understood what do you exactly do. Do you do a vigil Saturday night? But that's more of like I see that as more like uh, a prologue to Easter Sunday rather than a meditation of Saturday.
Yeah.
And I've seen when I served at the cathedral, a few years ago, we had a Holy Saturday service early on in the morning, and it was very much a continuation of, I guess you said in that theme, Calvin, that it's a continuation of Jesus' suffering. And so yeah, it's like, what do you do with Holy Saturday?
Yeah, and I think too, like the parishes I've been at hasn't been a real strong tradition of what that is or what that means or how it's celebrated. One thing that I've kicked around as a kind of a pastoral way of thinking is there's an emphasis often on having a vigil, Easter vigil. And in all the contexts I've ever been at, that's happened. I mean, the sun is maybe starting to set on Saturday afternoon. Which can, that feels a lot different than very early on Sunday morning, Easter morning. But I think there's, it seems to me that pastorally there's sometimes a disconnect between the idea of wanting to have an Easter vigil service and then what is Sunday morning as well. And one of the things that I've played with, haven't been able to put into practice, but an idea that I've played with is making the case to vestry or whatnot that an Easter vigil service is for the parish. Whereas the Easter morning service could be more about the folks who only show up at Christmas Eve or Easter or visitors or so
that's a good point.
Yeah, which is something I think there's I get that. I feel that challenge a lot more so in the Episcopal Church than in other traditions that I've been part of, is that we have this incredible evangelistic opportunity on Easter Sunday, but there seems to be a wanting to hold on to it for ourselves almost. We want to kind of have the experience for ourselves, and maybe experiences that aren't as visitor friendly, for example. And so
yeah, the vigil is such an unusual in comparison to any service you would come to throughout the year. It's so unusual. It's dark, and then you have all these readings. For a visitor, yeah, that would be, you're really diving right into like ancient liturgical, type of environment.
Yeah, and especially, assuming that you probably won't have. I've never had somebody, a non-regular attender attend a vigil service that I've been part of. It's always and in the situations I've been in, it's not even, it's the real hardcore. It's the 10%, the 20% who are really want to be part of that service, which I think is fine, is great. But then saying, let this service be the weird service, and let's have Easter morning can be more something that we can share. Maybe bring the threshold, the bar down a little bit lower, or make it a little bit more accessible. because that's when people are going to show up. And so on maybe an Easter Vigil sermon is dense and is real meaty and kind of thinking through all these different themes that you're having in the readings, whereas the Sunday morning service is more evangelistic. I mean, not to contrast. I mean, evangelistic.
I know what you mean. It's
theological,
but very
it's outsider oriented instead of insider oriented.
It's the TV opportunity Easter Sunday morning, right? Versus the vigil, so to speak. I know what you mean. I was going to say, I guess I was unaware of how the church viewed. I mean, you mentioned how the church viewed Holy Saturday, at least for so long up until Calvin, as like a Sabbath, which I never even knew that that it was seen that way. I'm just unfamiliar. It must have been while you read the book. It must have been it must have been informative on the history,
definitely.
Right?
Yeah,
about how the church saw it over the years, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and the big question comes down to is, I mean, he uses the phrase in the creeds. I mean, he descended to the dead, and then so what is the dead? Is that Hades? Is that Sheol? Is that hell? And that's where kind of Calvin especially makes the transition that the early church up until Calvin really understood it as the dead being a place of soul slumber, of sleep, of anticipation. Whereas with Calvin and that's where you have this other. I mean, it wasn't only Calvin's fault. Calvin gets blamed for enough stuff, but it's the question of, did he descend to the dead or did he descend to hell? And while we use those two terms very interchangeably sometimes, you can't. And if you kind of pull those two apart, it seems that the scriptural picture is much more about Jesus descending to the dead, which, yeah,
when did you start saying
it's the seventh day of the week. It's the Sabbath. He's resting, and then the new creation starts up on the morning of the eighth day.
And when did it go? I'm just wondering, because the Apostles' Creed comes about 2nd century, and I don't know. We don't really. I know there's all kinds of scholarship on the origins of how that came together, and there's just a lot up in the air. There's lots of we don't know. But I wonder. I mean, it seems very early on there was this view that Jesus descended to hell, right? That's because it was changed, and from what I've always seen in the different forms, it goes to the modern versions. It's changed to the dead. So
yeah, and I think it's been a little while since I've read it, but I think part of his argument is what does hell mean, and so it's, I mean, it's similar if you're an Anglican and understand kind of what Thomas Cranmer and others were doing at the time of Reformation. I mean, Cranmer gets rid of altars, and they're now tables, and gets rid of the Mass. It's now communion, and I think it's Bishop Colin Buchanan, who makes this argument that the other word that you would seem to want to get rid of would be priest, because priest implies a
sacrificial type of
system, and yet Cranmer keeps priest because he says, well, it's just the English word presbyter. I mean, it's just smashed together, right. And so it's kind of two words that one word that can mean two different things. And so Emerson's contention is that for most of church history, Jesus is understood as descending to the dead, and because in a way hell doesn't exist until Christ dies and is resurrected, because everyone is in Sheol. You're kind of in good Sheol or bad Sheol, good Hades or bad Hades. Either you're there waiting with anticipation or waiting with dread, but you're still waiting for something to happen.
Yeah.
It's not an eternal place. And that's, I mean, N.T. Wright makes that argument the other way often, that we get confused about what heaven is all about. I think Chad Bird wrote something this week too. We get confused about that heaven is the destination. And no, heaven is the waiting room, and the new heavens and the new earth is the destination.
Yeah.
And so that's a similar kind of the reverse argument, that Hades is the waiting room for either judgment or salvation.
Hmm.
And so what happens on Holy Saturday is Christ descends to the dead and announces victory for those who have placed their faith in Yahweh, and announces judgment to those who have not. And that's what he contends. I mean, Emerson contends that the preaching that Christ does on Holy Saturday to the dead isn't salvific preaching. It's not giving a second chance to those. It's preaching as proclamation. This has now happened, and then the faithful to their reward, and the unjust to their reward. So
so this could segue into either one of two books that I like.
Okay, go for it.
Well, you mentioned Cramden Reformation. That could go into the book Faith Alone: What the Reformers Saw, Why It Still Matters.
Well, my other two books are both about that. So
Okay.
those they'll all go together at the end. So go with the other one.
We're just talking about eschatology. So I'll go ahead and go to my and give us the title and author again for our listeners of that book you just spoke about.
It's called He Descended to the Dead, an Evangelical Theology of Holy Saturday, and it's by Matthew Emerson. And it was, like I said, I think it was 2020. It got a lot of 2019, but I think it might have been Christianity Today's Book of the Year, or in one of their categories.
One of their categories, yeah. I know they do have like an academic theology category. They have all kinds of categories, but
yeah.
I heard of that book. And that it was good. But thanks for recommending it. So on the note, picking up where I left off on the note of eschatology, that leads me into the next book, the Oxford Handbook on Eschatology. So it sounds like a very academic, heady title. But I'll preface this by saying, in my own life, and I've really grown more and more interested in the topic of eschatology, because I've realized how like central it is to the Christian faith, how like fundamentally central is to being a Christian. Like when we worship in the liturgy, once I really started to, I guess, think more about eschatology and read things on eschatology, and I realized you can hear the words from the liturgy in worship in a whole new, not a whole new light, but it's fuller grasp of what this is, because it's the complete orientation of what we're about as Christians. And it was time. So, and I'm kind of cheating on this book because the Oxford Handbook on Eschatology, it's like all Oxford handbooks. It's a big, thick, meaty volume of numerous, it's an academic work. I found this one just very fascinating and enjoyable to read. And
they're individual essays, right?
Yeah, they're individual essays, and I'm cheating a little bit because I bought this in 2020. I believe I started to read some of it because it's not a book you have to sit down and read straight through. It's a reference book, right? And I believe I started to get into it in 2020. I read a bunch of it in 2021. I used it for something. Something from it I used for something I can't even recall what it was. And then recently, during this past Advent of 2022, I pulled it out again. And it wasn't for anything I was teaching. It was for That's right. The year before 2021, the reason I used it because I was writing a term paper where I needed to look up some stuff about how in history how Christians have approached the Book of Revelation. But actually, it was for a sermon in Advent this past year that I pulled this out again, and But just to define the terms for listeners, of course, eschatology is a fancy theology word for what Christians believe about the end of all things. What basically Zac was referring to when we got to the end of his talk on his book. But pop culture, media, literature, they've taken on this topic in sensational, wild directions, left behind series. Because it can be a scary thing, when we think about the apocalypse. But of course, for us Christians, it involves the second coming of Christ, the culmination of history, not only death but rebirth, and renewal and consummation of this world. And so it's a hopeful thing, really. And so, if you're a liturgical Christian, like I said, pay attention next time in worship to see how much what we say and what we pray, so much of it is oriented toward this notion of a future, in the Eucharistic prayers especially. I mean, it's a foretaste of the heavenly banquet. So there's basically an Oxford handbook for like every topic under the sun, and there was this had like a star-studded, this Oxford handbook especially had it was like a star-studded cast. So you had Richard Bauckham wrote a chapter in it.
Okay.
Wolfhart Pannenberg wrote a chapter. This was back when he was alive. I think it was early 2000s, mid 2000s when this one was published. I had a few names written down here. Robert Jewett did a chapter on, interestingly, on eschatology in pop culture. William Lane Craig did a chapter. David Bentley Hart did a chapter. Rosemary Ruther did the feminism chapter. So it was just, lots of kind of big names in theology world. My favorite chapters from it were Benedict Viviana, who's a Jesuit theologian. I hadn't heard of him before, but he did a chapter on called Eschatology and the Quest for the Historical Jesus, which was interesting. It was kind of a overview of all the different quests of the historical Jesus, in modern critical scholarship, and of course how so much of it went off base when eschatology was when they lose the fact that was central to the mind of Jesus.
That was because you have to measure. That's the measuring rod. I mean, where does this lead? What does this
mean?
If you follow this out, this way of thinking into the resurrection and whatnot, where does that leave you? Yeah.
Right. And basically, if you don't have an eschatological Jesus, he turns into basically 19th century bourgeois values, liberal Jesus. Of course, that was the big criticism of the 19th century quest for, and so 20th century comes, and there's this fascination with eschatology. In fact, a lot of it comes from that historical Jesus. I mean, whether you see it in liturgical scholarship, systematic theologian, it's really all because of the correction that Albert Schweitzer made to the historical Jesus. It's just fascinating how it's all connects there. But another good chapter was Gerhard Sauter, I think it's Sauter's chapter on eschatology in the Protestant tradition. That was really interesting, but I would say the most helpful chapter on that, the one I think that most practically applies for preaching and teaching, is Timothy Weber's chapter on millennialism in there, because that he explores, premillennialism, what it is, amillennialism or amillennialism, postmillennialism, even other older traditions of is it preterist?
Yeah, preterist.
preterist, historicist. He goes into like, he defines like all the different ways the book of Revelation has been approached. Is it describing things that have already happened? Is it describing a future thing? Is it a combination of both? Is it allegory? Is it literal? All those things. It's a very helpful chapter. I've used, honestly, I think this book, I mean, if you're going to own any Oxford handbook, because they cost a few dollars,
Yeah.
If you're a preacher, preacher, Christian educator, whatever, or teach at your church, this would be the one to have, I think, just because these are always the big questions. It's always the book of Revelation. Did I say the book of Reformation earlier? The book of Revelation.
I don't think so.
I get a Freudian slip.
This as long as it's not Revelations.
Not Revelations, yeah. But I mean, that's always, sometimes it's the elephant in the room. It's the big thing people don't think about. What ultimately is to be. And this book was just helpful on that. Even that chapter alone by Timothy Weber. Oxford Handbook on Eschatology, numerous contributors, of course. I think Jerry Walls was the editor of it, but very good. It's really I would say a must-have. Like if there's 5 theology books someone must have, that would be like one of them.
And it's, like you said, it is such an important topic because I find, I mean, you do always have somebody who either wants to teach or wants you to teach like the adult ed on Revelation. Like, let's sit us down and explain how this, like, you're gonna be the first clergy person to explain this all to us. But even when that doesn't happen, that question of ultimate destiny was with us all the time, and I find, I did a class on N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope, which I've already mentioned once, so I'll try not to mention it too many more times. But this past year, and that's talking about, Wright's term is life after death. I mean, what happens after heaven, the new creation, and I find, I mean, especially, I think it's interesting that there was apparently the essay about eschatology and popular culture, because I think there's so much. I mean, part of it is the church's fault for not teaching on these things like we should, but at the same time, there's so much that just kind of seeps into us from other places about these things, and so we get these ideas about what life after death is all about, or the apocalypse, or these things, and that are really pastorally harmful, and people don't acknowledge, they don't realize, sometimes they don't even realize that they have these ways of thinking. And then when you kind of start unpacking, well, what does scripture teach, and they kind of like, oh, okay, well, I've always thought this, and that was what I found is I'm always, whenever I get into a conversation around eschatology, I'm always surprised by at least one person who has some pretty goofy views about what it's.
But like you said, it's everywhere in the culture. Not in the popular Christian culture that at least that once was. It's begun to wane, of course, but Left Behind series came out of that.
But even less than that, I think, because that's true. And I grew up in that culture. I mean, I'm very, but even just, I remember just trying to explain to this woman, like, our bodies will be physically resurrected.
Yeah, most people have a Plato view that.
And she just couldn't wrap her mind around that. And then even when she was kind of like, okay, well maybe, but then it was, well, I don't want my body to be resurrected. I don't. This is not. But she was very serious. It wasn't just kind of what's our heavenly body's going to look like. I mean, it was her. She just felt so much shame and so much kind of disgust and frustration with her body. that she didn't want to be bodily resurrected. She would rather be a spirit and just floating around. And so
and wouldn't, I mean, for all of us, there is some type of seeming freedom that comes along with that thought of not being limited anymore, because we think
that was part of her
limited, right? And so just to be able to be a spirit, it seems like those limitations are now taken off us. It's very, I can see how it can be like a something you would desire, but yeah, I mean, like you said, it's yes, our bodies are resurrected. No, not in the, but those things that those things that we feel, the limitations, the shame, whatever, those matter, we think now. But yeah, it's but yeah, a lot of people, they have the Plato view. And this, I mean, when and 1 second, I hear someone saying something. I'm gonna do a lot of editing on this episode. So. Hello. I'm gonna be. I'll be done like. Okay. Okay, I'm back. Cool. I meant to mute, but okay, I'll have to do the editing. And I know it's already 2. Where are you at for time? I mean, I don't have a.
I have. I mean, I have a lot to do, but I don't have any deadline. I mean,
okay. Well, I don't want to steal all your time, but yeah. Anyways, back to a lot of people do the Plato view. And even when I was teaching high schoolers, they really appreciate. I could tell them here when we would kind of go over that and why we actually, and I would tie it back to what do we do when we gather for chapel when we say the creed. I would start to say we believe. Oh, what's the line? Before we believe in the resurrection of the dead. I would start to say the line in the creed, and then I would like pause and I'd like, all right, you say the rest, and they said we believe in the resurrection of the dead, and the light came on. It's like, wow, this is something we say, we proclaim, we believe every time together. What does that mean? Well, it means something very different from we're buried and we become worm food and then we're spirits floating on. It's like our bodies are important, and they're not bad things, and they're
and that was for me. I mean, and N.T. Wright's book was where that light bulb went off for me. But my reaction was the complete opposite of this woman, because I was, and I mean, I read his book. I mean, after, I guess I probably wasn't in seminary yet, but I mean, I did undergrad in kind of, I did a pre-seminary undergrad. I mean, I should have figured this out long before I did, but I was terrified of the idea of kind of the afterlife, because that idea that I'd gotten in my head through pop culture and kind of lazy readings of scripture and whatnot, that disembodied kind of everlasting, like it felt overwhelming. It was like agoraphobic or something. I mean, it was, and then to it was like, oh, like we will be physically, bodily resurrected. I mean, not that I'm so attached to the one I got now. I mean, there's definitely room for upgrade, but it was our life after death will have meaning and will not just be a floating of kind of free floating spirits in clouds, on angels on clouds playing harps types things. I mean, so and then they run into somebody who had the completely opposite view of, no, I want to be just that drop of water in the vast ocean of eternity or whatever. I mean,
it's like Star Wars, like it's the the phantasm of Obi-Wan Kenobi or something. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but so let's the book you didn't like.
Book I didn't like.
What up with the dislikes? Yeah.
I read a ton, and I try to not only read books that I know in advance that I'm going to like.
I need to get better at that. So when I come across one I don't like, it's a real surprise. But not this time for my example, but they'll see. So let's get into yours. So
so the book it's called Earth Filled with Heaven. The subtitle is Finding Life in Liturgy, Sacraments, and Other Ancient Practices of the Church. And so I gotta back up a little bit. So I kind of alluded to this a little bit. So I grew up in non-denominational churches, but very kind of dispensationalist. We have charts for the end of time. We know exactly what's coming. And everything.
Jesus didn't know, but you knew. Yeah.
Everything's literal. And we're just, some of us have dates for when it's going to happen. And went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago in my undergrad. And that is historically has been a bastion of dispensationalism in the U.S. The guy you referenced, Tim LaHaye. So Jerry Jenkins, the co-author of the Left Behind series, for example, was a Moody alum and donated large portions of those profits to Moody. So they have they've been well benefited from this dispensationalism and all that. So interestingly enough, I wouldn't expect that a book about sacramental theology and liturgy to be written by somebody from Moody Bible Institute or published. It's actually published by Moody Publishers. The author's name is Aaron Damiani, who he was actually I forget what the term was, but he was the resident director of the dorm that I lived in. So I kept a pretty low profile. I recognized the name when I picked up the book, but I don't know him personally. He's a ACNA, Anglican Church in North America priest in Chicago, church planner. And what he's done with this Earth Filled with Heaven is it's written specifically to non-liturgical, non-denominational evangelicals, and a way of saying what would that you should really discover liturgy, and you should discover these ancient, quote unquote, ancient practices of the church.
Yeah.
Are you still there?
I'm still here yet.
Okay, sorry. And so he lays out a vision of what that might look like. And so he's got a chapter on, he starts off by talking about being in these non-denominational, especially mega churches for him, and realizing at some point that he was ministering in them, was part of them, but he was just burned out and felt like he had never really experienced the idea of come unto me, all ye who are heavy and weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
Right.
And so he's experiencing this spiritual burnout and starts attending a liturgical church in Chicago. And that experience of weekly communion and the church calendar and what is just very transformative for him, and ends up as an Anglican and now an Anglican priest, Anglican church planner. So he talks about different things, talks about the Eucharist, baptism, the calendar, the liturgy, passing of the peace, prayers of the people, the mission, going out at the end of the service, go in the name of Christ, that type of thing. And then what he calls scripture, creeds, and old prayers. So the confessing the creeds weekly, using written prayers and whatnot as what is lacking in your spiritual journey. And if you kind of take these things on, you'll feel greater presence of God. I mean, all these things. And so it got me thinking as I was reading it, like, this sounds really familiar. Like, where have I heard this? Where have I heard this before? And realized that I got somebody at my door. Sorry, just a second.
You're good.
So I realized that this sounded very familiar. This kind of premise that Damiani was laying out, that what evangelicals need to discover is liturgical practice and all this. And it goes back to, I'm not sure directly. I'm not sure if it was kind of on his radar or his intention. And my guess is it probably is not. But in the and this is a brand new book. I mean, this came out this like in August. I think I actually got an advance copy because if you go to confessinganglicans.com, that's a blog that I participate in, and there'll be a book review probably before this goes live, but that I wrote about it. But I think it ties into a much older book written in the early mid 1980s, Evangelicals on the Canterbury Trail, Why Evangelicals Are Attracted to the Liturgical Church by Robert E. Weber. And that book is now about 40 years old. A guy named Gillis Harp, who is a professor at Grove City College in Pennsylvania and attends the Anglican parish there, just wrote a piece on Modern Reformation's website about Weber's book, and kind of looking back at over the 40 years. And Weber is someone who taught at Wheaton College. It's kind of a sister college in a lot of ways to Moody. He was a professor there and found himself being attracted to more liturgical. He grew up Baptist, more liturgical settings. Ended up in the Episcopal Church, and then from there on out was very much a champion of why liturgy and these things were important, and what was, and then there's an attraction to them for evangelicals, non-denominational evangelicals. But I think the reason I didn't care for Damiani's book isn't because it C.S. Lewis talks about when you're judging a piece of art or literature, you have to judge it based off of what it's trying to do. You can't kind of decide that it doesn't work because you don't like it.
Well, that's kind of what I did with my book, The Latter Approach, but that's all right.
I'm trying to. So Damiani, I think he succeeds, which is why I don't like his book, because he's makes this case for the value of liturgy and whatnot, but he does so in a way that I think he cuts some corners historically, especially. And that was something that Weber did, I believe, as well, in that with Weber's coming out of the liturgical renewal movement, especially, and folks like Dom Gregory Dix, famous liturgist and whatnot, and what I see happening and what others have seen happening is that there's kind of a pick and choose of a picking and choosing of history, and liturgical history, and an assumption that folks like Thomas Cranmer and other reformers, that it's a very modern approach of thinking, that they didn't have as much. They didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls, or they didn't have as much stuff to draw from, and if they did, they would have done things differently.
But I've heard that about later on. Gregory Dix's liturgical scholarship had some big problems with it, and that it was revisionistic to a certain extent. So, and that's.
Yeah, and I think that, and I don't think that Damiani's trying to kind of, he's not intentionally going with that, but I think it's a bit of an unexamined understanding of liturgy, what liturgy is for, what liturgy does, what liturgy is based on, and so. Right. Liturgy, just going through a liturgical service is not of value unless there's something valuable about what you're doing liturgically, or if there's an underpinning of what is trying to be communicated liturgically. So Zach Hicks, for example, liturgical scholar right now in Anglicanism, just wrote a book about Thomas Cranmer, and he argues that Thomas Cranmer is concerned about justification by faith, and everything he does goes through that screen. And that's what makes his liturgies valuable, is that they're trying to communicate this very important doctrine of the church.
Well, you said when we were messaging each other prior to this episode, you said that the big problem you had with this book, Damiani's book, is that there was no that it was Damiani was making a case for worship without any overarching theology.
Yeah.
So saying with someone like Zach Hicks, for instance, he sees, and I see it too, behind the prayer book, underneath driving all of Cranmer's words and the tweaks and revisions Cranmer made, and what was the concern with the centrality of he had an overarching theology, and justification plays a central part, would be Zach Hicks, the way he sees it. And that's not what Damiani is, or Damiani's not really giving that much thought, the historical meaning.
Yeah,
the prayer book comes out of, right? The doctrinal concerns that are very connected to the liturgy, right?
Yeah, Damiani is convinced that liturgy is valuable in and of itself.
Okay, yeah. And that's my big issue. I don't mean to keep interrupting. I'm sorry, but that's you get me going now, because that's been my issue with a lot of, if not distinctly Anglo-Catholic, a lot of their influence, a lot of their touch on Anglicanism is that liturgy is an end in itself. And also you kind of saw, and you see this with a lot of Dix's scholarship, from my understanding, and the liturgical renewal, all these things that did have an influence on the 79 prayer book, which we use in the Episcopal Church. And I like the 79 prayer book, so I don't want to take it wrong, like as far as right to and stuff. But there was this emphasis that it's all about like the space and the ritual and the action and unspoken things, right? Which just sounds like it comes out of some contemplative monk type of thing, and I'm not, but it seems like that received all this emphasis now, and being too wordy is now all of a sudden being too doctrinal or whatever, or
limiting and kind of taking up space. Our words are taking up space that, we should be listening for the Spirit or something like that.
Yeah, and so I don't know. I imagine, without reading Damiani's book, I imagine you just kind of got that sense in there of that.
Yeah, and I think it's, like I said, it's not intentional. And it sounds good. And most of what he talks about, also, interestingly enough, isn't really. He's an Anglican priest, but he's not talking about the Anglican tradition. He's just talking about liturgy broadly, and I think there's also, I think it's part and parcel of the same issue, but for him, and I think, and this will lead in well to my next book. I'll give you a chance to talk, but there's this idea that the American evangelicalism already has the theology right. Just need to live it out in a different way.
So he's kind of, what you're saying, if I'm understanding, he's kind of like jumping to the other extreme. He's running as far away as he can from what he came out of. Where having a dead set theology, and at least the way it's done in like American evangelicalism, is not always healthy. And can be very unhealthy and destructive. And so I don't blame the getting away from that part, but going to, well, no, theology just comes about organically and through osmosis once the liturgy does its thing. I'm not over on that end either, and that's what I sense in a lot of modern Anglicanism. And so
and I think it's going from one extreme to the other, and which a lot, Weber argues is very appealing. like this is what evangelicals need. We just need a different way of kind of living out our experience of our theology. But I've found, and a lot of times, that what ends up happening then is the Anglican tradition or kind of a broadly liturgical-ish kind of tradition ends up serving as a halfway house. From you're escaped from an evangelical, so this North American megachurch, non-denominational evangelicalism, and you've discovered this liturgical tradition that I mean, I'm in it, so I can say it. But I mean, Anglican and Episcopal liturgical tradition can be very sloppy, at least compared to seemingly compared to like Rome or Constantinople. I mean, the Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah.
And so what is the discovering of liturgy as the be all end all. But if the liturgy is the be all end all, well, Roman Catholicism does liturgy better than any Protestants do. I mean, Eastern Orthodoxy does liturgy better than any Protestants do.
I may differ. I think Eastern Orthodoxy does. I don't know about Rome. I think Rome.
Well, okay.
I think they're a hot mess.
But I mean, again, it's what is liturgy and what is it trying to do? But if you want that experience, I mean, what I'm concerned that I would have is you're trading one type of experience, the mega church, personality driven North American evangelicalism, for another experience,
right?
And both at the extremes, both are very hollow. And yet that's something that I think is kind of well, based on the fact that Aaron Damiani is writing very similar stuff to what Robert Weber did 40 years ago. I mean, it's still happening.
It's still happening. And I mean, part of what we do on this podcast is to show that there's a middle way between those. It's a vast middle, of course, but there's between those two extremes. The Reformation has a different ethos, and that's what
and you have to have, and so you have to have a theology underpinning your worship experience, and that's what both of those are lacking, and that's what I like coming from. I mean, Aaron Damiani and I are very similar kind of similar stories.
I mean, you found your way to Anglicanism from that world,
but that wasn't what the kind of physical liturgy wasn't attractive to me, and wouldn't have been attractive. It's still not attractive to me in a lot of ways, but what was attractive was the theology of the Anglican tradition of the reformers, and then seeing how that plays out. That's the only way that the liturgy is meaningful or helpful or anything. So the moral story, liturgy is not helpful in and of itself or meaningful in and of itself. Would be my qualm with that book, though.
Yeah, I hear you. So the title again for our listeners, and I'll go into my
Earth Filled with Heaven: Finding Life in Liturgy, Sacraments, and Other Ancient Practices of the Church.
Okay. And that's Zach's dislike, and now we're gonna go into dislike. So my dislike, I gotta even see what the title of that book was. Oh, so I have Logos for software. It's helpful for maybe a lot of our listeners use it, but it's helpful. That's software that's useful for I guess looking at it. It's just a helpful what's the word? Not a template, but just an interface of how you can pull up passages from scripture, theology texts, and anyways, helpful software. And when I got the package that I actually, and it's free to subscribe to, it's just different products you can pay for to get downloaded. But when you sign up for it, you get a lot of free stuff. And I don't know why. I think I was going through New Testament resources on there. And part of this was because of where I served the last year and a half at Ascension, where I taught. I taught a New Testament class. So I was just kind of pulling up some basic I was trying to find some like New Testament textbooks on there, because I have all these ones for free, just to like, anything I could glean from
Yeah.
there and use. And I came across, and I found myself reading it because I was like, because on one end I found it an interesting read, but I just wholeheartedly disagreed with whatever this author took, every direction this author took. So the book is Paul and His World: Interpreting the New Testament in Its Context by Helmut Keister. And Helmut Keister is a German scholar. I think he died several years ago. And, he taught at Harvard, and he taught at some other, big time school in the States, but he was trained in Germany. But, so I'm just going to read you this quote. And I'm just going to read this quote for you. And I just want to see your reaction. I pulled up my logos. Quote, "Here is what I imagine happened after the death of Jesus. The disciples and friends of Jesus would have gathered again after Jesus had died and had been buried. What did they do then? They certainly did not form a committee that was charged to collect and write down everything that they could remember and gather with pencil in hand like good journalists, including further information from eyewitnesses. Rather, the friends and disciples of Jesus did what they, you see, I'm like reading this in a condescending voice. I'm sorry. Rather, the friends and disciples of Jesus did what they had always done in the company. They gathered together, read the scriptures, sang the Psalms, and prayed as they broke the bread and blessed the cup. When they did this, they realized that Jesus was mysteriously present among them."
Dun, dun, dun.
What do you think about that, Zach? Do I need to go any farther with this book?
That's exactly what I would have done.
It's kind of like it's like an academic version of Spong, at least that one. And Keister is no Spong. He's a very accomplished New Testament scholar. And I guess during his time at Harvard, he was very, unlike a lot of New Testament scholars, Keister was actually very much, he was always, in constant dialogue with the classics department, with the systematic department. I mean, it was really, it was, I guess, he was there during a time when Harvard actually had, some, some leading and reputable, Heiko Oberman was there at the time. And but I was just reading this because I just wanted to. I was trying to put some stuff together, finding good content to kind of like pare down into the high school version of the New Testament class I taught.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh my gosh! The passage. This is not Holy Writ. The paragraph that I just read from that. It just kind of tells you all you really need to know about this.
Yep.
But so yeah, it was just a lot of and it made me realize and again, I don't know why I spent my time finished, because it's a big book. Some interesting information though about late Second Temple and then early AD, that whole time period which the New Testament arises from. It's got interesting historical things, but it's just the epitome of like working from a complete historical critical assumption on everything. It was almost
like, there's other. I mean, that's the. I mean, when there's other people who can do that Second Temple Judaism stuff for you and not screw up the resurrection. I mean,
right.
So
and right. And I think I could just read Josephus if I wanted to. I don't know if I wanted to go primary works, but so I'm like reading this and it just seemed, and there's this really bizarre chapter in there where he talks about the divine.
Froze up on my end, sorry.
Did I freeze up on your end?
Yeah, but it was probably my fault. But yeah.
Okay. Did I tell you about?
You said you could read just Josephus. That was basically the last thing I got.
And then I froze up. Okay, so then there was a bizarre chapter in there as well about this concept of the divine man, And so basically, this was Keiser's argument, if I'm remembering. I don't have it pulled up in the reading, but I'm just going to try to paraphrase best I can and summarize best I can what he said about this divine man concept. So he basically says that in ancient Greco-Roman culture and in their mythology, there was this like concept of a divine man, which represented everything strong and valorous. I mean, we think of like Orion and Hercules, right? So there's this like divine man thing. And then us moderns are no better because we still have this divine man idea. Like and there's some
we can't get away from it.
Right. And there's some valuable critique to there's some value to this critique that he's getting at, because it's like we prop up, the person that's supposed to be the ideal citizen or the ideal leader, right? And then we shy away from our, the vulnerabilities we all carry, and it's just an ultimately, destructive thing to do, and we've done it throughout all human history.
Yeah.
Well, the New Testament writings, as they talk of Jesus, of his likeness and equality to God, and in the early church, where we see the understanding of the early church is that Jesus is divine. That's just, he calls it, I think he even calls it propaganda at a point or another. It's just the Christians basically just bought in to the myth of the divine man, and that's and
just a new name of it.
And in order to, and I don't think he's not doing it to like tear down the church, but that's all. I just think that he ultimately, it's what he's doing, because basically we need to get away from this idea, and that Jesus's humanity is what is really was what we should focus on.
Yeah.
And it's just
and it goes back to that. I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about in eschatology, I think. And I mean, Fitzsimmons Allison's great line. I mean, the cruelty of heresy. I mean,
right.
It's so like okay. I'm not trying to undermine everything that the church has ever taught, but then you do, and it's like, well, where does that leave you? And there's that article I think it was during the pandemic maybe, and New York Times, I think it was New York Times or the Atlantic, something along those lines, and it was this woman who was writing, and she was talking about I think she's a psychologist, and she gives advice to she has non-religious parents who come in and say like, well, how do I talk to my children about death? Mm-hmm. And she said, lie to them, tell them there's an afterlife, tell them everything's going to work out in the end, tell them, even if you don't believe it at all, even if you don't, that's actually more beneficial. That was, and she's like, it's to our benefit to believe in an afterlife, essentially. Mm-hmm. And which I thought was just fascinating. But it's like this, okay, great, you've now told us, you've now destroyed Christianity, now what do you want us to do? If Jesus, it's 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ is not raised, well, screw it.
Right. Well, and again, Keister already, just as we clearly denies the resurrection in that one, paragraph. But this is on this. So let me read you this part. So this idea that we need to get away from, the divine man myth, and then he contrasts Jesus as a human to the importance of seeing Jesus as human. This is what he says. He says, the reference to perfection that Jesus has, you will be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, characteristically follows up upon the commandment to love one's enemies. Perfection is giving oneself rather than becoming oneself. So here he's saying, divine man is about like building yourself up, you need to give yourself away. Then he says, on this basis, the Christian message, based on, Jesus as a human, was capable of founding communities of people from all classes, races, and genders. The concept of the divine human being has been radically reinterpreted, the truly divine human beings are those who give themselves for others, even to the death on the cross, because God has appeared in Jesus, neither the most powerful nor the most virtuous, but a self-giving love. God is not power, rather God is love. Well, it's like, I agree, like it's almost like a half truth at work, right? It's
Yeah.
like, because I agree that by God taking on flesh, he has radically subverted man's idea of what a God is, or man's idea of what a God should be. That's the power of the incarnation. God embracing a cross is the power of the scandal that we Christians present. But I don't think that needs to be taken in a direction that says, that rejects like divinity, and understanding that Jesus as God still has all power and is sovereign. It was just a weird critique, and he's trying to like tie it into this modern day society and saying that we need to be self-giving. Well, I agree with that, but it was just like, it was like just was not
the cure is worse than the poison.
You're right. So let's go on on a more positive note. And by the way, that book, for anyone, and if you have Logos, you may have it for free. Paul and His World, Interpreting the New Testament in Its Context, by Helmut Keister.
Yeah, so there's the books that we didn't care for. So back to sandwiching this: two goods, one bad. Put the bad in the middle, so we forget about the bad, and in a positive note.
Let's because of time, and I'm sorry, I know we were going to do 3 likes. Do you want to each do one more like?
I'll combine my 2 into 1. How about that?
Sounds good. I'll do 2 as well, and I'll just combine it and be quick with it.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
So my last like is, it's called Children of the Promise: The Case for Baptizing Infants. Mm-hmm. It's by Jeffrey Bromley. So as I've said a few times now, not raised in liturgical tradition, not raised in Baptist churches, but churches that did not baptize infants. And that was one of the things that was hardest for me to wrap my head around in coming into the Anglican tradition. Like, okay, we baptize babies. Why do we baptize babies? Why, in kind of biblical case, that type of thing. And I've been convinced for a few years now, but I'm always, whenever I see something with a book with the subtitle, The Case for Baptizing Infants, or Why You Should Baptize Your Children, something like that, I always pick it up and read it, because I hadn't come across a book that I thought it did a good job of explaining that. And
it's a hard argument. I'll admit that it's a hard argument to make. I mean, I've had Baptist, non-denom, and fundamentalist friends. My whole life I've been either Lutheran or Anglican, and then that was always been the big thing. Like, well, so I can almost get on board, but what about baptizing babies? What's your rationale for that? Yeah, I'm kind of just caught, like a deer in headlights. I'm like, well, we've been doing it for a long time.
I think for me, part of what happens. Oh, you froze again.
Or did I freeze again? Now you froze. Can you hear me, Zach?
Yep, I'll stop my video too.
The last thing I said was I'm stuck like a deer in headlights.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't say anything after that. You got the deer in headlights.
Yeah, so I'm always on the lookout for these books, always, and what I've found is that most of the ones I've come across, it really comes down there's too many presuppositions for somebody coming from an adult only baptism. It's circumcision, baptism equals circumcision. So, and it's like, that's such a big jump. Like it is
a big jump. Yeah.
I mean, that's where most people get stuck. So you can't just start there. And I found that a lot of these books, because and this happens on both sides of the debate. I mean, I suppose if I'm reading books that we're arguing the other way, it would be just as much. But I've found a lot of these types of books to be very argumentative, not written in a very pastoral spirit. I think they've tried to be, but they don't come across that way. So I picked up this book, Children of Promise: Case for Baptizing Infants, Jeffrey Bromley, and in my reading, I think he does the best job of of making this case, of making it clear, making a clear biblical case for why you should baptize infants, and does it in a very pastorally sensitive way. He's just winsome. So after I read it, I thought, like, wow, that was a really good book. I should find out more about this guy. And it ends up that he's an Anglican, Church of England guy. The book was written in 1979, but it's actually a consolidating of the work that he did as his PhD thesis, which that is called Baptism and the Anglican Reformers. So I suggest both of them to you, but I thought it was really interesting. It struck me that part of the story I tell is being attracted to Reformed theology as a teenager, especially, but finding the scripture that I was presented with made sense to me, but the people who were making the case didn't make sense to me, because they always seemed very argumentative, always very sure of themselves, not very pastoral in how they kind of, well, just believe this. And I know that's not true of everyone, but that was part of what I discovered in the Anglican tradition was
it's very there could be a good argument you're saying, but it's always most people's reason. Yeah, it's kind of just unexamined. It's like, well, just believe it.
Yeah, and not only just unexamined, but very dogmatic, or very and so
what's Bromley's case?
I mean, basically, and this, as far as I can tell, I mean, I don't think infant baptism makes much sense outside of a covenantal theology. I mean that covenantal theology is completely antithesis to a dispensational theology that I grew up with, and so he just makes a case for covenant theology, essentially, and but he does so in a way that it is winsome, that is scripturally based. I don't have the book in front of me. It was so good that I immediately gave it to somebody else to read, and they haven't given it back yet. So I'm working from memory, but and it's a little bit longer. I mean, some of the other books, like Brian Chappell, I think, who's a Presbyterian, he has a book for why the case for baptizing infants that's like 30 pages long. This one's 132 pages. It's not something that you can just kind of immediately hand to somebody and say, oh, you can read this in 10 minutes and be convinced. It's a little bit longer, but it's written at a popular level, a very pastoral way. And because I think it's even more helpful because it's from an Anglican perspective, and I think just his way of going about his theology is more pastoral, and so is a little bit more winsome. But yeah, like children of the promise, the case for baptizing infants, and then if you're intrigued by that, or want a little bit more of a historical understanding of that, his bigger book, his academic book, is Baptism and the Anglican Reformers, and there he talks. I mean, it's 4 sections. He says he starts off by talking about, what is baptism, who are the participants in baptism, what is the rite or the ceremony of baptism, what's going on there, and then grace. How do we understand grace in that? And it's very methodical. I mean, chapter 1, and then you have point A, point B, point C, point D, and then point. I mean, right. So it's not hard to kind of wrap your head around. He does. I mean, even though he's writing for an academic level, he can walk you through it the same way that he does in the popular level. So
the author of that is Jeff Bromley. And for our listeners, Zach and I were talking like before the episode, and I was like, wait, who's the author? And he said Jeff Bromley. And I've come across Bromley numerous times because he's very interestingly also a major translator of German works.
I would say he's done just as much. His translations are just as significant as his own works. He, for a lot of us may know, the multi-volume, theological dictionary, the New Testament, the big blue books by Kittel, or compiled by Gerhard Kittel. Bromley was a translator of that. Bromley translated several of Barth's works. And he also translated Pannenberg's 3 volumes. So it's just very interesting. Whenever I come across like an Anglo theologian who's very in touch with the German side, that's always interesting, because sometimes there's a gulf there. But
and he seems like a fascinating guy. And maybe he's worth somebody digging into more. But I mean, like I said, he's an Anglican clergyman, and he's writing about, obviously has a very pastoral side, has a very theological side, in that he's translating all this German. He ends up in the U.S. First he ends up at the English Episcopal Church in Edinburgh, Scotland, and then he ends up in the U.S. teaching at Fuller Seminary, which is, I mean, it's not kind of Moody Bible Institute, but not somewhere I would expect somebody like him to end up at.
Right.
And so he's very multi-dimensional kind of guy.
Interesting guy. So, but we will go.
Your last one.
My last one. So my last one, I enjoyed it a lot. Read it over the summer, and it's from 2015. It's Faith Alone: What the Reformers Taught and Why It Still Matters. So this was part of a 5-part series called the Solas. The 5 solas are the 5 principles which define what for Protestantism is. I think most of our listeners know that. There's sola fide, which is faith alone. That's what this book was on. The Doctrine of Justification. This book by Thomas Schreiner it's a very accessible read, and it basically lays out the teaching, the doctrine of justification by faith alone. He spends some time saying what it is in the first part, and then the rest of it's basically him engaging with all the relevant passages from Scripture that speak of salvation, especially as you can imagine, Paul's letters, but really throughout all the Bible. And Schreiner makes a case that without being anachronistic about it. I mean, he's really a careful scholar. He's a New Testament scholar, which is interesting. He surveys a lot of church history, and he's a New Testament guy. And he knows, and I'll get to this in a moment, he knows Reformation and especially Luther scholarship real well. But he's basically making the case that the 16th century reformers, what they taught is a faithful reading and rendering of what Scripture says about salvation. So do you know Schreiner at all, Zach? I don't know if you've read it.
I've come across him a few times. He has one really helpful book that I forget what it's called, but it's kind of an intro to studying the New Testament, and that I was introduced to by Wes Hill in seminary, and have revisited that a few times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's written a lot, and it's not all just been biblical study stuff, and but he's done his fair share on that as well. I mean, I think he wrote a called the Handbook on Acts and Paul's Letters. That's really good for a preacher or teaching.
I think maybe that might be the one that I'm thinking of.
That one, that's really good for like preachers and Christian educators, because it's a concise, accessible, textbook in a way on Paul's letters in the Book of Acts. I won't spoil too much of this book, the other book I'm talking about by him. But and I think like it's important to know he's more on the conservative side, or he belongs to a conservative strand of Baptist. So he's not going to say or do anything that will. I get the sense he's not going to. He's careful not to get in trouble with his co-religionists. But honestly, I think the book was carefully weighed. For the most part, I think faithfully represented opposing views. He tackles the new perspective on Paul, which for our listeners,
our episode with Stephen Chester several episodes ago, breaks down exactly what the new perspective is. Stephen Chester on that talks about what the value he finds in it, but where he thinks it goes wrong. But basically, the idea of that the reformers read Paul wrong, and T. Wright, James Dunn were big proponents of that. Though it's not a monolithic scholarly movement, but it's basically falls under the umbrella term of new perspective. But Schreiner kind of takes that on, and I want to share this quote on what Schreiner says about regard to that. He says, "I don't doubt that the inclusion of Gentiles apart from the boundary markers was an important issue for Paul, but the boundary markers issues must be read against the broader backdrop of Paul's thought, where he rejects righteousness by works fundamentally," unquote. And I like that because I think it's as clear and as as articulate, and that Wright and Dunn and people who argue for the new perspective are, I feel like they ignore that backdrop, whether it's in Galatians where, Paul is addressing a situation of, justification. He's talking about it because it means that the kingdom of God is open to Gentiles. He is focusing on a more ethnic, situation there. But when he gets to Romans, he's talking about it. He's clearly and plainly talking about it broadly, that Paul is clearly in opposition to the idea that our works contribute to our salvation, and it's not just Torah work, like observing Torah. He's talking about it's the complete idea of us earning.
Yeah, it's keeping the main thing.
Right.
Whereas that's, and I think it happens when we talk about atonement theories too. Sometimes, you kind of have like a little pet atonement theory that you want to be like the controlling thing, and it just doesn't work.
Right. Well, it is, because it's like
it's part of what's going on, but it's not the overarching.
Right. And I think substitution atonement's correct, but I also think Christus Victor is correct. I mean, there's mentions to what Jesus' work on the cross says, right? And same with justification. It has many layers and dimensions to it. But I'll refer to listeners to that Stephen Chester episode if they're more interested in that topic. But I'll just say I like this book by Schreiner. I think for our Lutheran listeners, obviously this broader Protestant principle of sola fide in its Protestant articulation comes from Luther. And so for our Lutheran listeners, I think they can really appreciate Schreiner, even though he's a Baptist, whatever. He's really engaged in Luther scholarship. He cites Wangert, he cites Bernhard Losey, Robert Kolb. His chapter on, like, if you don't know anything about Luther, like if someone doesn't know anything about Luther, they could literally just read the chapter in the beginning of the book where he writes a chapter on Luther before he gets into doctrine of justification.
Before he goes anywhere else.
Right. And someone who knows next to nothing about Luther could read that section of the book and come away with a firm understanding of everything Luther was about theologically. It's actually does a really good job. So I'm just like, because it's like you have this different sub-disciplines. You have the biblical guys over here, and you got the theology guys over here. And I just applaud someone who can who can, do the homework and get an understanding across those, barriers we sometimes put up, between that. But it's a good book. Again, the title is Faith Alone, The Doctrine of Justification, What the Reformers Taught and Why It Still Matters, by Thomas Schreiner, with a foreword by John Piper, interestingly. So but it's good. So
very good.
So this is and my third one I never got to. I'd been cheating because I didn't finish it, but it's related to the note I ended on. I finally got around to starting Roland Bainton's popular bio of Luther. That was the big bestseller from 7 years ago. It's still like the standard popular bio. Finally got around to it. I was like, oh, it's 99 cents on the Kindle store, at least like some off publisher edition of it. So I just got it, and I spent a few days over kind of the Christmas break from. It was kind of it's a break for me because I was a teacher, even though I was still at services on Christmas Eve. But yeah, it was. I read through. It was a fast read because it's enjoyable. It's it's very good. So yeah. So Roland Baton's Here I Stand, I think it's called. So
okay, very good.
Well, Zach,
thanks for letting me ramble about the books I've been reading.
Thanks for letting me ramble. We had some good conversation, I think, on these books, and we had some interruptions, each of us did, and we had some technical glitches, and so I apologize for our listeners that you may or may not even notice, because I may be able to edit and to polish it all up, but if not, know that we are human, two guys sitting by their computers, and
life in parish ministry,
and we're in the parish. We're both of us literally in our parish offices, and so people come by our door, and our listeners, I know that is important. So but we appreciate you listening in and putting up with us and taking interest in what we have to say, because it's this is, I'm blessed to be able to do this podcast, and we're blessed to have had Zach on again for his third
appreciate
time.
it.
So we'll definitely have you on for a fourth time, and
is this like Saturday Night Live? Do I get a jacket or something after I've done like 5 times or whatever?
Oh my gosh, we should do that. I think we had T-shirts for a while, and
maybe a pin. Yeah,
we had T-shirts that got canceled after like a day. Not really cancel culture canceled, but like we went through some. I think it's T Public, and I didn't know, like, if you go through them, they will, like, if you don't sell so many in like a day, they'll just drop you from.
Oh.
So but before that happened, Stephen and I were able to order 2, and
limited edition.
Yeah, and so we literally have rare. They might be worth money. I don't know.
There you go. Someday.
But that was back when we kind of restyled and got a different cover art, and it's kind of rebranded as a Reformation-y podcast. Not that we didn't always have that in a sense, but so that's the old school shirt. It's the one with the steeple on it, and it says,
you better
Protestant historical.
Hold on to that.
Sorry,
you better hold on to that
for sure. Yeah. Well, Zach, thank you. God bless. I know you got things to do, and
thanks for having me.
So
looking forward to paying attention to what else you guys are up to. So.